Last year around Christmas, I decided to go all out with decorations. I just moved into my first solo apartment in Seattle, a cozy place near Ballard with a nice view of the neighborhood, and I was determined to make it feel like home. I thought a Christmas tree would be the perfect finishing touch. I didn't have a car, so I ordered one for delivery from a local place that advertised on Craigslist. They guaranteed it would arrive fresh and perfectly set up, which sounded great since I had no clue how to put one up myself. It was supposed to be dropped off between 6 and 8 p.m. When it got to 9 p.m. and no tree, I figured maybe they were running late with other orders. I tried to reach out, but the contact number I'd gotten for the delivery service went straight to voicemail. It was almost 10 p.m. by the time I heard a loud knock on my door. I jumped a little, wasn't expecting them to knock so hard. I opened the door to see a guy standing there with my tree. He looked older than I expected, maybe mid-50s, tall and wearing a faded brown coat. He had this scruffy beard and an awkward smile, like he was trying too hard to be friendly. He pushed the tree through the doorway before I even got a word out. I started to thank him, but he cut me off, insisting he help set it up. I didn't want to seem rude or ungrateful, so I let him in, though I was starting to feel a bit uncomfortable. He took his time adjusting the tree, explaining that it needed to be just right. He lingered, messing with the branches even after it looked fine to me, and kept glancing around my apartment. I was starting to get nervous because he wasn't leaving, even though the tree was clearly in place. Finally, he stepped back, nodded, and mumbled something about how the place looked really cozy. He kept his gaze on me for a beat too long before heading out. I made sure to lock the door as soon as he left, trying to brush off the uncomfortable feeling. I figured I was just being paranoid, and went about decorating the tree, trying to enjoy the holiday vibe. An hour or so later, I was ready to call it a night. I checked that the front door was locked and double-checked the window locks, a habit I'd picked up since living alone. I went to bed feeling a bit unsettled, but told myself I was overreacting. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint but repetitive, like someone walking slowly on my deck. My apartment was on the ground floor, and the only barrier between my living room and the outside was a sliding glass door leading to a small patio. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon, but then the footsteps got louder, like someone was pacing in slow, deliberate steps. I stayed in bed, frozen, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes, and I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just a neighbor passing by. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the unease. I got up and went to check the lock on the sliding door, just in case. The next morning I woke up feeling more rational, chalking up the night's scare to my imagination. I got up, made coffee, and went to the patio to get some fresh air. That's when I noticed the boot prints. They were big, muddy prints leading right up to the edge of the sliding glass door and circling around the windows on the front side of the apartment. My stomach dropped. The prints were fresh, still damp from the morning dew, and looked exactly like the boots the delivery guy had been wearing the night before. It was like he'd been pacing around, looking in through each window. It creeped me out, but I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe he was just doing one last look to make sure everything was okay with the tree. It was a weak excuse, but I was trying to avoid thinking the worst. I decided to go about my day as usual, though I felt on edge whenever I was near the windows. For the next few days, things seemed normal enough, though I couldn't shake the memory of those boot prints. I'd check outside occasionally, but I didn't see anything suspicious. About a week later, I was in the living room late at night scrolling through my phone when I heard a noise outside. This time, it was the unmistakable sound of a door handle rattling. My blood went cold. I crept up to the sliding glass door, staying out of sight, and peeked around the curtain. There was someone standing right outside, barely visible in the glow from a streetlight down the road. I couldn't make out his face, but I saw the same brown coat, the same boots. He stood there for a few minutes, not moving, just staring at the sliding door. I backed away slowly, grabbing my phone and going to my bedroom to call 911. As I dialed, I heard the rattling again, followed by the sound of something scraping against the door frame. The police showed up within 10 minutes, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. They checked the area, found the same boot prints in the mud by the patio, and advised me to keep my doors locked and call them if anything else happened. I felt a mix of relief and frustration, relieved that they took it seriously, but frustrated because I felt like they wouldn't be able to do much if he came back. Over the next week, I tried to stay vigilant, keeping all my doors and windows locked at all times. I avoided going out at night and got into the habit of keeping my curtains drawn. The days passed quietly, but every time I'd walk into the living room at night, I felt this uneasiness, like he was still out there somewhere, watching. One night I was lying in bed when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the deck. My heart started racing as I sat up, listening. I heard a soft tapping on the sliding door, like someone was knocking with their knuckles. I stayed still, barely breathing, hoping he'd think I wasn't home or asleep and leave. But the tapping continued, slow and steady, like he was trying to wear down my nerves. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening to see if he was gone. But then I heard something far worse, the sound of a key turning in the front door lock. I'd always kept my keys in a drawer, and suddenly I remembered. The delivery guy had been alone in my apartment for a few minutes while setting up the tree. He must have seen where I'd left my keys, grabbed them when I wasn't looking, and made a copy. Panicking, I bolted up and rushed to the door, twisting the deadbolt just as he tried to push the door open. I stood there, heart racing, pressing my weight against the door as I heard him grunt in frustration, then silence. I don't know how long I waited there, leaning against the door, waiting to hear him leave. The police came quickly this time, and I finally told them everything. The tree delivery, the lingering, the boot prints, and now the key. They took my story seriously and recommended changing the locks immediately. They couldn't find any trace of him when they arrived, but they assured me they'd keep an eye on the area. After changing my locks and adding a security camera, things finally settled down. But even now, every time Christmas rolls around and I see people ordering trees for delivery, I get this cold, creeping feeling. I threw a holiday party, but I wasn't alone after everyone left. This happened a couple of years ago in early December. I was living in a small townhouse in Chicago, and with the holidays around the corner, I decided to host a little get-together with close friends. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a small Christmas party with drinks, food, and some music. My friends and I all work odd hours, so it was rare that we all got to hang out like this, and we wanted to make the most of it. Everyone came over around 7 p.m., and we had a great night catching up, playing games, and sharing a lot of laughs. It felt like a perfect holiday evening. As the night wore on, people started heading home one by one, until finally, the last of them left a little after 2 a.m. The apartment was quiet and dark, and I felt that strange mix of exhaustion and restlessness you sometimes get after a big social event. I wasn't ready to go to bed yet, so I spent a few minutes cleaning up, gathering empty bottles and stacking dishes in the sink. My place was a bit messy, but I didn't mind. It could wait until morning. Once I was satisfied with the state of things, I decided to head upstairs to my room. I made a quick round, checking that the doors and windows were locked. Everything was secure. I climbed the stairs, brushed my teeth, and finally slipped into bed, ready to pass out. At some point during the night, though, I woke up with this nagging sense that something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I lay there in bed, wide awake, feeling like I wasn't truly alone in the house. My room was dark, and the only sound was the faint hum of the fridge downstairs. I chalked it up to leftover nerves from the party and tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid after having so many people over. I turned over, trying to get comfortable again, and that's when I noticed something odd. My phone was lying on the nightstand where I'd left it, but the screen was lit up, like it had been recently used. It showed the lock screen with the time, 3:27 a.m. I knew I hadn't touched my phone since I got into bed, so why was it awake? Feeling a little uneasy, I reached over and picked it up, only to find the camera app open. The last photo taken was showing up on the screen, but it wasn't anything I remembered taking. My stomach dropped as I stared at the image. It was a picture of my living room, taken from the angle of the couch. There was a blanket crumpled up on one end, but in the background, I could see myself, lying on the couch, asleep. I felt my hands go cold, and I tried to steady my breathing. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Someone had taken this picture while I was asleep downstairs. My mind raced, trying to think of an explanation. I wondered if one of my friends could have taken it as a prank, maybe before they left, but the timestamp showed it was taken at 3:12 a.m., well after everyone had gone home. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at the photo, trying to make sense of it. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was probably just a mistake, a glitch, something weird with my phone. I took a few deep breaths, put the phone down, and lay back down, determined to ignore it and get some sleep. The next morning, I got up, still feeling uneasy. I decided to double-check the house, even though I'd already locked everything up the night before. I went downstairs, checked the front door, the windows, and the back door. Everything was locked tight, just as I'd left it. It didn't make sense, and the whole thing was starting to feel like a bad dream, but I knew that photo was real. I'd seen it with my own eyes. When I walked into the living room, I noticed something that sent my heart racing all over again. One of the drinking glasses from last night was on the coffee table, and it had a thin layer of condensation on it, like it had been used recently. I knew I'd cleared everything before going to bed. In fact, I distinctly remembered putting all the glasses in the sink. Yet, here it was, one glass, sitting out in plain view, almost as if someone had come back to finish their drink after I'd fallen asleep. I tried to tell myself I'd just missed it in my cleanup, but there was no denying that it hadn't been there the night before. I'd been careful to clear everything away, so how had this one glass ended up here? I stood there staring at it, feeling more and more on edge. I grabbed my phone and opened the photo again, zooming in on the details of my living room. It was definitely taken in the middle of the night, and I could just make out the same glass on the coffee table, but the blanket on the couch was arranged differently. Someone had been in my house, watching me while I slept. Feeling panicked, I went to check my security footage. I'd recently installed a small security camera above the front door that was supposed to capture any movement in the entryway. I pulled up the footage from last night, scrolling to around 3 a.m. As I watched, my skin started to crawl. At exactly 3:05 a.m., the camera captured the faintest shadow moving across the front door window, but it didn't look like someone entering or leaving. It was as if someone had simply stood there, watching the door, maybe checking to see if it was locked. I played the footage over and over, hoping to catch some detail I'd missed, but it was useless. The shadow was barely a blur, and there was no way to tell who it was or what they looked like. I shut off the video, feeling more unsettled than ever. I tried to go about my day as usual, but the thought of someone watching me through the windows, sneaking around my home while I slept, was impossible to ignore. I didn't want to tell anyone about it because I figured they'd think I was overreacting or imagining things. For the next few nights, I couldn't sleep properly. I'd wake up at odd hours, listening for any unusual sounds, and constantly check my phone to make sure no new photos had been taken. I even started locking my bedroom door at night, just in case. The whole experience left me paranoid, jumping at every creak and shuffle in the house. About a week later, I started finding more strange things around the house. The blanket on the couch would be moved slightly, or a chair would be out of place. Nothing major, but just enough to notice. I kept the doors locked at all times, double-checked every window before bed. But it didn't matter. I could never shake the feeling that someone had been there, moving things just enough to mess with my head, leaving little reminders of their presence. It felt like I was being watched, not from afar, but from the shadows of my own home. That Christmas, I ended up spending most of my time at friends' places, avoiding my own house whenever I could. I haven't hosted any parties since. To this day, I don't know who took that photo, or how they got in, but I've never been able to forget that cold, empty feeling of knowing someone was there with me, watching me sleep. Last December, my daughter really wanted to meet Santa, so I took her to a big mall in Chicago where they had a whole winter wonderland set up. It was packed, with kids running around everywhere, lights strung up, fake snow, and holiday music blasting from every direction. I thought it'd be the usual experience, maybe some long lines, but otherwise pretty straightforward. It was supposed to be just another mall Santa, something to check off our Christmas to-do list. We finally got to the front of the line, and my daughter was thrilled. Santa, though, looked a bit off. He was unusually thin and pale, his suit hanging a bit loose, and there was something about his eyes that made me uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just some guy doing a holiday gig. Still, his appearance felt strange enough that I noticed it right away. My daughter climbed onto his lap, grinning ear to ear, and he asked her what she wanted for Christmas, the usual stuff. I stood a few feet away, snapping a picture and watching the interaction. After they finished talking, Santa looked over my daughter's shoulder and made eye contact with me. It was intense, almost too focused. He then leaned down, close to my daughter's ear, and whispered something to her. I figured he was telling her to be good or something like that. Typical Santa talk. When she hopped down and ran over to me, she had a big smile on her face, so I thought it was nothing. But as we walked away, I noticed she was unusually quiet, like she was deep in thought. I asked her what Santa said, and she just shrugged, saying it was nothing important. I didn't press her on it, but the whole thing was unsettling. Later that night, when we got home and I was tucking her into bed, she finally spoke up. She told me Santa had whispered our home address to her. My stomach dropped. I thought she was mistaken, or maybe she'd misheard, but she repeated it back to me. Our exact address, clear as day. My daughter's only 7, and there's no way she'd just come up with something like that. I didn't want to scare her, so I brushed it off and told her it was probably just a coincidence, or maybe she misunderstood. But after I left her room, I started feeling anxious. I kept going over it in my head, trying to make sense of it. There was no logical explanation for why a random mall Santa would know our address, let alone whisper it to my daughter. I tried to convince myself it was just some bizarre coincidence, maybe something she misinterpreted, but the feeling stayed with me, like something was off, something I couldn't explain away. The next day, I decided to go back to the mall to see if I could get some answers. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I figured maybe the mall had hired an actual actor or something, and maybe he did weird things to keep up the mystery of Santa. When I got to the mall, though, the whole Santa setup was gone. I assumed they'd just relocated him to another part of the mall, but when I asked an employee, they looked confused. They said they hadn't had a Santa there at all the previous day. I pressed further, asking to speak with someone in charge. Eventually, I got a hold of a manager who confirmed that the Santa they had hired had been out sick and hadn't shown up for work that day. The entire setup was supposed to be closed, so they had no idea who'd been there taking photos and interacting with kids. At this point, I was feeling genuinely freaked out. The only explanation they could give was that some stranger had put on a Santa costume and somehow slipped into the mall unnoticed. I left the mall with a heavy feeling in my chest, like I'd brushed up against something that just didn't belong. I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd whispered our address to my daughter. I tried not to panic, but I found myself checking every lock on my doors and windows that night, making sure everything was secure. Thankfully, nothing happened after that day. Life went back to normal, and the strange feeling slowly faded. About 5 years ago, my family and I spent Christmas at our cabin near Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. I'll never forget it. There were strange, silent signs that someone else was there. Not someone we could see, just signs. This is a place my family has visited since I was little. It's always been quiet, almost isolated, surrounded by dense woods, and the only sounds were from the trees or the wind. It was the kind of place you'd think was cut off from everything else. We'd arrived a couple of days before Christmas, excited to relax, cut off from work and the noise of our regular lives. The snow was heavier than usual that year, so we spent a good chunk of time settling in, clearing paths, and making sure the fireplace was ready to go. My parents had invited a couple of friends, and everyone was staying for about a week. The first day or two went by smoothly. There was nothing unusual, just the same quiet atmosphere I'd grown up with during every holiday season. It was on the third day, though, that things started to feel off. I was out gathering firewood in the morning when I noticed a small pile of stones just a few feet away from our front porch. At first, I thought it was just something one of the younger kids had set up out of boredom, but it looked deliberate, like someone had spent time stacking them carefully. They were all the same size, placed in a perfect circle, and they were exactly 7 stones. I brushed it off as harmless, but made a mental note to ask the others about it later. By the time I got back inside, I'd completely forgotten about the stones. We spent most of that day baking and decorating the cabin, putting up lights and the usual Christmas decorations. The kids were having a blast, and there was no reason to be concerned. We'd all settled down in the living room for the evening when my mom's dog, Daisy, started growling at one of the back windows. Daisy was usually calm, not one to bark at just anything. Her growl was low, focused. I didn't think much of it, though, and eventually she settled down. The next morning, I went outside to grab more firewood and noticed that the stone circle had been moved. There was a second circle, too, larger, with more stones, placed a bit closer to the cabin. This time, the stones were scattered around in a sort of broken spiral pattern, almost like they were pointing in different directions. It made no sense. I thought maybe one of the kids was playing a prank, but it seemed a little intense. Why go out into the freezing cold to stack stones in the middle of the night? That night, Daisy was restless again. Her growling started as soon as we settled down. This time, I got up to check, feeling a bit uneasy. I turned off the living room lights and went to the back window to look outside. I stared out into the darkness, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows between the trees. And there, just beyond the porch, barely visible between two trees, was the shape of a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the trunk of the tree. My breath caught, and I slowly backed away, deciding not to say anything. I didn't want to scare everyone over something that could have been a trick of the shadows. But that night, I barely slept, listening to every little creak, every shift in the wind. The next morning, I walked outside to find even more stones arranged in the snow, all within a few feet of each other, forming a sort of broken path leading from the trees toward the cabin. I pointed it out to my dad, who shrugged it off as something natural, maybe even from the melting snow rearranging rocks. I didn't buy it, but I decided not to argue. It wasn't like we could pack up and leave over some rocks in the snow. Besides, we had family friends there, and everyone was having a good time. That day, I tried to put the stones and the figure out of my mind, focusing on enjoying Christmas Eve. But by the evening, the feeling was back, like something was hovering just on the edge of my vision. When Daisy started growling again, this time with more urgency, I couldn't ignore it. I got up and made my way back to the window, watching the spot where I'd seen the figure the night before. At first there was nothing, but after a few minutes, I saw it again. This time the figure was closer, standing near the last tree in the clearing. It was just a shape, tall, unmoving, watching. I didn't wait around to see if it would move. I pulled the curtains shut and went back to the others, heart pounding. I kept the curtains closed, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself that it was just my imagination. Still, Daisy wouldn't settle, her gaze fixed on the back door. We went to bed late that night, and I kept the lights on in my room. Every sound felt amplified, each creak of the cabin sounding like a footstep outside. On Christmas morning, I woke up before everyone else. I had this weird feeling that I needed to check the outside. Stepping out into the cold, I walked around the cabin, and there they were. More stones, scattered all around the front porch. They were closer than before, some of them almost touching the steps. It was as if someone had been standing right there, looking at the door. There were no footprints in the snow, just the stones. My stomach twisted as I kicked one of them aside, feeling a strange, simmering anger mixed with fear. Later, when everyone was awake, I brought it up, describing the stones and the figure I thought I'd seen. The others looked a little unnerved, but brushed it off, saying it was probably just someone camping nearby, or some prank from locals who knew there were city people staying in the cabin. I tried to let it go, but it was impossible to relax. That whole day, I felt the weight of invisible eyes, even when we were all sitting around laughing, eating, trying to have a normal Christmas. That night, everyone went to bed early, exhausted. I was the last one awake, watching the fire slowly die down. Daisy had finally calmed, curled up next to the couch. It was so quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of branches outside. Just as I was about to head to bed, I heard it. A soft, almost rhythmic tapping against the front door. I froze, the sound so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. But there it was again, 3 steady taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. My blood went cold. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. After what felt like hours, the tapping stopped. I waited a long time before finally moving, tiptoeing to the door to look through the peephole. There was nothing, but as I opened the door just a crack, I saw them, the stones, arranged in another circle on the porch, directly in front of the door, closer than ever before. We left the next day, cutting our trip short. My parents brushed it off, saying it was probably just kids or some harmless prank. But I knew there was nothing harmless about it. This happened on one Christmas night in 2019. That night I'd settled into my couch with a glass of wine, watching some random holiday show. My place was small, so the kitchen, living room, and bedroom all sort of blended together. My phone was on silent, and I was pretty disconnected, not expecting any calls. It was around 10 p.m. when the landline rang. That landline phone had come with the apartment, and I'd never used it or given the number to anyone. I figured it was a telemarketer or some wrong number. But it was Christmas Eve, and something about the timing felt weird. I let it ring for a bit, thinking whoever it was would just give up. But the ringing kept going, so I finally decided to pick it up. As soon as I said hello, I heard an old man's voice on the other end. He sounded friendly enough at first, kind of soft-spoken, like he was in his 70s or 80s. He started by saying my name, my full name, first and last. The way he said it was oddly familiar, like he was an old family friend or someone who knew me well. He wished me a Merry Christmas, which would have been fine except something about his tone felt off. It was too familiar. At first I was polite, thinking maybe it was someone who'd misdialed or just a lonely old guy. I asked him who he was and if he was trying to reach someone. He didn't answer my questions, though. He started talking about things from my childhood, little details that no one would know. He brought up my favorite stuffed animal when I was a kid, something my mom had sewn for me that I'd named Patches. No one in my adult life knew about Patches. I hadn't thought about that thing in years, and it kind of freaked me out that this stranger knew about it. The more he talked, the more he dug into these old memories, details about family holidays, things that happened when I was young. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who this guy was and how he could possibly know these things. He even mentioned my first pet, a little terrier named Rocky, who had died when I was 7. It was like he was reading from some detailed script of my life, all these memories I hadn't talked about in years. I kept listening, not saying much, feeling this growing sense of dread. There was something strange about the way he was recounting these memories, like he was savoring each one, like he knew they'd mean something to me. After a few minutes, I cut him off and asked him again who he was and how he knew all this. He paused for a moment, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. That's when he said something that still gets under my skin to this day. He told me he'd see me soon. After that, the line went dead. I sat there, holding the phone, my mind spinning. My apartment felt darker and colder, and I had this unsettling feeling that I'd just been watched. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was some prank or a telemarketer who somehow managed to dig up personal details to mess with me. But it didn't add up. I wasn't the type to share things about my childhood, and even if someone had looked into my social media, they wouldn't have found the things he mentioned. The more I thought about it, the more I started to freak out. I checked the lock on my door and even peeked out the window, but there was nothing unusual. My building was quiet, as most people had already gone out of town for the holidays. I didn't sleep much that night, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out who could have called and why. I kept thinking about how he'd known those intimate details from my childhood. Every time I drifted off, I'd snap awake again, heart pounding, feeling on edge. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe I just had some weird Christmas Eve prank, or that someone was messing with me for fun. I spent most of Christmas Day trying to distract myself, but I couldn't shake this nagging feeling. I kept going over every possibility in my mind, trying to rationalize how someone could know all those things. The whole thing felt like a violation, like someone had gone through my life with a fine-toothed comb and then decided to taunt me with it. That evening, just as I was starting to calm down, I went to take out the trash. When I opened the front door to my apartment, there was a small package sitting on the floor outside my door. It was wrapped in simple brown paper, and there was no address, no return label, just my name written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. It was the same handwriting I'd seen in some of my grandparents' old letters, the kind that's almost too perfect. I picked up the package and felt this chill run down my spine. I had no idea who could have left it, or how they'd even gotten into the building. I brought it inside, my heart pounding, and sat down at the kitchen table. For a few minutes I just stared at it, debating whether I should open it or just throw it away. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully unwrapped it. Inside, I found an old, worn doll. It was instantly recognizable. The same doll I'd had when I was little, one that had disappeared when we moved to a new house years ago. It was in surprisingly good condition, given its age, but there was no doubt in my mind it was mine. It even had the little scar on its face, where I'd accidentally torn the fabric as a kid. Seeing it again made my stomach twist. I sat there, holding the doll, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. How had it ended up here, outside my apartment, on Christmas Day? It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen it in decades, and I couldn't think of a single person who would have kept it, let alone sent it to me. It was too much of a coincidence, coming right after that phone call. My mind was racing with possibilities, but none of them made sense. I ended up putting the doll in a box and stuffing it in the back of my closet. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want any reminders of that night. In the days that followed, I kept expecting the phone to ring again, or for another strange package to show up, but nothing else happened. It was like whoever had done this was content just leaving me with this creepy piece of my past. We rented a quiet house for the holidays, but something was very wrong with the place across the street. A couple of years ago, my girlfriend Carla and I decided to get away for Christmas. We both lived in Chicago and wanted a break from the noise and cold, somewhere a bit quieter where we could just relax without being interrupted. After looking around online, we found a small suburban house in Waukegan, Illinois. It was a peaceful neighborhood, not too far from the lake, and we figured it'd be perfect for a quiet holiday together. The house was simple, just a small, cozy 2-bedroom with a little yard, nestled in a neighborhood where all the houses were similar. 2 stories, wooden siding, some with holiday lights strung up. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was perfect for what we wanted. No crowds, no loud neighbors, just us, a fireplace, and some holiday movies. When we arrived, everything felt normal. The place was clean, quiet, and had a lived-in feel, like an older couple had taken care of it for years before renting it out. We unpacked, settled in, and made ourselves at home. We could see a few other houses in the area from our windows, and everything seemed standard. Kids played outside, a couple of people were putting up lights, and families were going about their day. The whole place felt like a scene from a Hallmark movie. But then, there was the house directly across the street. It looked exactly like all the other houses, but something about it felt off. For one, it was empty. No cars, no lights on, no sign of anyone coming or going. The lawn was unkempt, and there was a thick layer of dust on the porch, like it hadn't been touched in years. But it wasn't abandoned. Not exactly. It was decorated. A few string lights were half hanging from the eaves, and there was a large wreath on the door, dried out and brown. A Christmas tree was in the front window, decorated with faded ornaments, like it had been put up years ago and never taken down. We both noticed the house right away, but neither of us thought much of it at first. We just assumed it had been left that way by whoever owned it, maybe an older couple who hadn't gotten around to taking everything down. But then that night, as we were watching TV, I glanced over at the window and noticed something strange. There was a faint flickering light coming from the house across the street, like candlelight, moving slowly from one window to another on the upper floor. I pointed it out to Carla, and we both watched, a bit unsettled but curious. We didn't see anyone, just the faint glow as it moved from one room to the next, then disappeared. It was odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe someone had come by to check on the place, a family member or something. I told myself there was nothing to worry about. The next morning, curiosity got the best of me, so I took a quick walk around the neighborhood, hoping to see if anyone knew about the place. There was an older man a few houses down putting up lights, so I casually asked him about the house across from ours. He hesitated, glancing over at it like he'd rather not say anything, then just shrugged and muttered something about it being left alone for a while. He didn't offer any other details, and I didn't press him. But I couldn't shake the way he looked at the house, almost like he was afraid of it. That night, the lights came on again. This time they stayed on longer. The flickering moved around the house like before, slow and steady, sometimes vanishing for a few minutes, only to reappear in another window. It felt like someone was walking through the rooms, checking each one. Carla and I were both uneasy by this point, but we tried to ignore it, figuring that maybe someone was staying there temporarily or that it was some weird electrical issue. The next morning, we decided to just enjoy our day and avoid looking at the place. But as we were making breakfast, I glanced out the window and noticed something new in the house's front yard: footprints in the snow. They were clear as day, leading from the side of the house to the front door, but they didn't match up with any other tracks. There were no footprints leading up the driveway, no tire tracks on the street, just these single set of prints that seemed to come out of nowhere and stop right at the door. By now, we were both seriously freaked out. I called the rental agency, thinking they might know something about the neighbors, but they brushed it off, saying they didn't know anything about the other properties. They assured us that the neighborhood was safe and quiet and tried to change the subject, which only made me feel more uneasy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept glancing out the window, feeling a strange compulsion to check the house. Around 1 a.m., I saw the flickering lights again, and this time they were coming from the downstairs windows. I watched as the faint glow passed from room to room, pausing at the front window before moving to the next. I woke Carla, and we both sat there, watching. It felt like someone was pacing the house, checking the windows, almost like they were looking out at us. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The light stopped for a long time, just hovering near the window, then disappeared completely. The next morning, we noticed something even stranger. The Christmas decorations in the front yard had changed. The wreath was gone, replaced by a small stuffed animal, an old teddy bear, lying face up on the doorstep. The Christmas tree was still there, but it looked like a few ornaments had been moved around, their faded colors catching the morning light in a way that felt almost deliberate. I felt this overwhelming urge to go over and knock on the door, just to see if anyone would answer, but Carla talked me out of it. She was freaked out, and honestly, so was I. We decided to spend the day out of the house, heading into town to clear our heads and get some space from the weirdness across the street. When we got back that evening, it was already dark, and the house looked as empty as ever. But as soon as we walked inside, I felt like something was wrong. Our lights were off, which was strange because I distinctly remembered leaving them on when we left. I thought maybe there'd been a power surge, but everything else in the house was untouched. Nothing out of place, no signs of anyone having been inside, but the atmosphere felt off, heavy, like someone had been there. That night was the worst. We were sitting in the living room trying to watch a movie when the flickering lights across the street started again. But this time, they were different. They weren't moving. They just stayed there. In one window, like someone was holding a flashlight steady, pointing it directly at our house. It felt intentional, like whoever was in there wanted us to see it. We watched in silence, and after what felt like an eternity, the light went out. But then, as we were getting ready to go to bed, we heard a knock. Not at our door, but faint, like it was coming from somewhere outside, maybe even across the street. It was soft, almost rhythmic, tapping against the quiet night. We didn't sleep that night. We just lay there, listening, waiting for something else to happen. But after a while, the knock stopped, and the house across the street went dark. The next morning we packed up early, not even bothering to stay for Christmas. We locked up the rental, got in the car, and drove straight back to Chicago. A missing woman haunted my late shift as a mall security guard. Working as a security guard in a big mall isn't exactly thrilling, but when you're scheduled for the late shift, especially around the holidays, it's a different story. You end up alone in an eerily quiet building, surrounded by mannequins in festive clothing, lights that flicker occasionally, and music that continues to play through the mall's sound system even after everyone's gone home. I used to work as a night shift guard at the shops at Northbridge in Chicago a few years back, so I've had more than my share of creepy late-night experiences. But this one was something else entirely, and it's stuck with me since. It was a few weeks before Christmas, and the place was packed every night until closing. We'd go through our usual routine after closing time, walking the halls, locking up the entrances and making sure no one stayed behind. This was around the time that rumors started circulating about a woman who'd gone missing in the area. I hadn't paid much attention, chalking it up to gossip, since the holidays brought out all kinds of stories. But then I noticed that some of my coworkers were on edge, and a few were starting to get really weirded out about our night shifts. They'd claimed to see strange things on the cameras, like shadows moving in empty hallways or hearing distant footsteps when they were supposed to be alone. I figured it was all just paranoia. Malls are creepy at night, no question about it, but there wasn't anything supernatural going on, or so I thought. One night, I was doing my usual rounds, checking out the west wing of the mall where the higher-end shops were located. I'd been through there dozens of times, but that night, I felt this weird tension as I walked the corridor. Every now and then, I'd glance down toward one of the storefronts, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the odd feeling that someone else was there. I kept telling myself it was just because the holiday displays were set up. The stores looked different than usual, with dim lighting and mannequins arranged in these winter scenes that cast shadows across the floor. But something just felt wrong. When I got back to the security room, I sat down to check the feeds. That's when I first noticed her. A woman in a red coat, just walking slowly through the halls. She had her back to the camera, and from what I could tell, she was just wandering around, almost like she was lost. I couldn't figure out how she'd gotten in, since we'd locked all the entrances a while ago. I radioed my coworker to check the west wing again, thinking maybe someone had slipped by us. I watched the screen as my coworker walked through the hall where I'd seen the woman, but by the time he got there, she was gone. No trace, nothing, just an empty corridor. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe the camera had glitched, or maybe I'd just seen a reflection. But then I noticed something strange. The feed showed her again, this time on a different camera. She was still in that red coat, moving slowly, aimlessly. Her head was lowered, and I couldn't see her face. But the strangest part was that the cameras showed her passing through areas we'd already checked. She'd appear on one feed, vanish, and then reappear somewhere else entirely. Always in that slow, wandering way, like she didn't even know where she was. I kept watching, half convinced I was losing my mind. I scanned the feeds, waiting for her to show up again. When she finally did, it was on a camera closer to the food court, just standing near one of the closed kiosks. She wasn't moving this time, just standing still, facing away. I couldn't understand how she was getting around so fast without any of us spotting her in person. There weren't many places to hide in that part of the mall, but every time we checked, it was like she'd just vanished. It started to get to me. I checked the time, realizing I'd been watching this woman for over an hour now, and every time I called one of my coworkers to check a spot, they'd find nothing. I even went out myself once, sweeping the corridors, but it was like she was always one step ahead, slipping from camera to camera without a trace. And it was then, in the middle of all this, that I remembered the missing person flyer that had been up in the staff room for weeks now. It was for a woman named Emily. I didn't pay much attention to it at first, but I distinctly remembered the details on that flyer. A young woman, last seen wearing a red coat, had gone missing from the mall a few weeks back. That night, I couldn't get the image of that flyer out of my head. Was it possible that the woman I was seeing was her? After a while, my shift ended, and I left the mall feeling more unsettled than ever. The next few nights were calm. I didn't see her on the cameras, and no one else reported anything strange. I started to think that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, or that maybe it really was just someone who'd gotten into the mall and slipped out somehow. But a week later, it happened again. This time, the woman in the red coat showed up near one of the exits around 3 a.m. I saw her on the camera, moving through the back hallway that led to the loading docks. She was still walking that same slow, aimless way, her head down, hands in her coat pockets. I radioed one of the other guards to check it out, hoping he'd see her this time. I watched him on the monitor as he made his way down the hallway, and my heart was pounding. He reached the spot where she should have been, right by the exit, but there was no one there. I could see him looking around, clearly as baffled as I was. I kept the camera on that hallway, but there was no trace of her. Just the empty, silent mall and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. That woman in the red coat. I asked around, casually at first, trying to see if anyone else had seen her or had strange experiences. Some of the other night guards admitted that they'd heard things: footsteps, whispers, doors creaking open when no one else was around. But no one had seen her on the cameras. It was like I was the only one catching her on the monitors, like she was only there when I was watching. One of the older guards told me that years ago, a woman had disappeared from the mall and was never found. He didn't know much about it, just that she'd been a regular, someone who came to shop alone. I asked if he knew anything more, but he shrugged it off, saying it was just a rumor, probably an urban legend. A couple of nights later, I was sitting alone in the security room, half hoping not to see anything unusual, when the camera in the West Wing showed her again. The woman in the red coat, standing at the end of a long corridor, facing away. This time, though, she looked different. She was holding something in her hands, a small, stuffed animal. I recognized it immediately because it was from one of the kids' stores in the mall, a little bear that had been part of their holiday display. I watched her stand there, clutching the bear, motionless. And then, as I stared at the screen, she turned. I didn't get a clear view of her face, but I saw just enough to notice her eyes. She was looking straight into the camera, her expression blank, almost emotionless. And then she was gone. The feed cut out, just static filling the screen for a few seconds. When it came back, she wasn't there. I bolted out of the room, heading for the West Wing, telling myself that I'd find her this time, that there had to be an explanation. But when I got there, it was empty, just the cold, quiet corridor and the faint sound of Christmas music playing from the speakers overhead. I checked every store, every corner, but there was no one. The bear she'd been holding was gone too. That was my last shift at the mall. I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't keep staring at those cameras, waiting for her to show up. I never got an explanation, never found out who she was or what happened to her. I used to volunteer at a homeless shelter every winter around Christmas. It was this small, makeshift place, mostly just folding cots, donated blankets, and space heaters, squeezed into the basement of a church in the middle of a pretty rough neighborhood in Detroit. Not glamorous, but when you're trying to help people survive the freezing nights, comfort isn't the main priority. We all knew the risks and dangers that came with working late there, but it felt good to help. One Christmas, I signed up to work the overnight shift. A few of the other volunteers were there when I got in, but I was mostly going to be on my own after midnight. It was a particularly harsh December, and the city was struggling to manage the number of people who needed shelter. The place was packed, almost to the point where we couldn't fit anyone else in. People were wrapped up in blankets, sleeping on mats crammed together across the floor, and most looked exhausted and cold. It wasn't a comfortable setup, but for a few hours at least, they were warm. One man, though, stood out the moment I saw him. He was maybe in his late 60s, had these wild eyes, and looked around the room like he expected someone to jump out at him. His clothes were worn down to threads, and his hands were trembling, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else. He kept mumbling to himself under his breath, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. When I approached him, he barely made eye contact and seemed wary, but he muttered something about being followed and not being safe. He looked scared, but it was the kind of fear you don't see often, like he was running from something real, not just in his head. Eventually, he settled on one of the mats near the back wall and covered himself with a thin blanket. I tried to ignore his constant glances toward the entrance, though it was clear he wasn't sleeping. He lay there, his eyes darting around the room, and every time someone moved, he'd flinch. Most people in that shelter were just looking for a warm place to sleep, but something about him made me feel uneasy. Hours went by. The other volunteers left, and it was just me and about a dozen people scattered around the room, each lost in their own fight against the cold. I remember walking around, making sure everyone was settled, occasionally hearing muttered conversations or quiet snores. Around 3 a.m., I noticed the man wasn't on his mat anymore. I walked to the back of the room, thinking maybe he'd just shifted around or fallen off the mat. But it was empty. There was a dark stain on the blanket he'd left behind. I figured maybe it was just some old dirt or rust. This wasn't uncommon with the kind of wear these mats took. But as I looked closer, I realized it was blood. Just a small smear, but it looked fresh. I couldn't shake the sight of it, and part of me wanted to track him down to see if he was okay, but something held me back. The way he'd been acting, the blood, none of it sat right with me. The rest of the night passed quietly, and by morning, I was exhausted. I figured I'd mention the bloodstain to the other volunteers when they arrived for the morning shift, but before I could bring it up, one of them burst through the door with her phone out, saying she'd just seen something on the news. They were talking about a man, matching the description of the guy I'd seen, who'd witnessed a gang shooting a few years back. He'd gone into hiding afterward, and it seemed he'd been on the run since. They said he was one of the only people who could identify certain gang members, and there were rumors the gang had been tracking him down. I remember just standing there, trying to process the information. I kept picturing him lying on that mat, shivering, his eyes darting around, and now it all made sense. He hadn't been paranoid. He was genuinely terrified. And that blood on the mat, maybe he'd been hurt. Over the next few days, things felt tense at the shelter. It wasn't the usual exhaustion or stress from dealing with a full house, it was a lingering fear. People in the area started talking about a group of guys seen hanging around the church late at night, watching people come and go. They didn't seem like the usual homeless crowd. They looked out of place, dressed a bit too clean, and they stayed in the shadows, watching. Some volunteers even claimed they saw the same guys multiple nights in a row, never approaching, just observing. One night, just a week or so after that shift, I was walking to the shelter for my usual evening shift when I noticed smoke rising from behind the church. My heart sank as I realized it was coming from the direction of the shelter entrance. As I got closer, I saw flames licking the side of the building, and a few of the other volunteers and guests were standing outside, staring in horror. The fire department arrived quickly, but by the time they put out the flames, the shelter was destroyed. The police came to investigate, but they didn't seem to have any real leads. The fire was ruled suspicious, though, and the rumor was that it was arson. There wasn't much left after that. With the shelter gone, we couldn't host people anymore, so we had to turn them away or refer them to other overcrowded places around the city. The regulars drifted off, finding other spots to huddle up during the nights, and a few even tried camping out near the church. But it didn't feel safe anymore. I stopped volunteering at night after that. It wasn't just because the shelter was gone. Something about the entire experience left a mark. Knowing that we might have gotten caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than any of us realized, it made me look at everything differently. We rented a remote ski lodge, and someone else was already there. Last winter, I went with some friends to a cabin near Breckenridge, Colorado. It was an isolated place on a slope, far enough away from the main town to give us some serious peace and quiet. We'd rented it for 5 nights through a site that offered remote getaways, and the idea of spending a snowy Christmas in a lodge sounded perfect. There were 6 of us, all old friends from college, and we'd been looking forward to the trip for months. The cabin itself was rustic, a bit older than it looked in the photos, but comfortable enough. It was a large 2-story structure with exposed beams and a wood-burning stove. The kitchen was well stocked, and the living room had big windows that looked out over the snow-covered mountains. The only issue was that it was very isolated. We were surrounded by trees, and the nearest neighbor was about a mile away. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. We thought that'd be a good thing. A break from all the usual distractions. That was what we thought, at least. The first night was great. We got in just before dusk, unpacked and settled in. Everyone was in high spirits, joking around, and talking about hitting the slopes the next day. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. That evening, I went outside to grab firewood. I brought a flashlight, but the light was barely enough to cut through the darkness. As I stacked some wood to carry back in, I felt like the forest was closing in. Way too quiet. Then I heard a faint crunching noise, almost like footsteps in the snow. I scanned around with the flashlight, but all I saw were trees and darkness. It's eerie being out there, alone. So I shrugged it off and went back inside. When I came in, my friends were gathered around the window, looking out into the dark. They were all silent, which was unlike them. Finally, one of them told me they'd seen someone standing near the tree line while I was out. Just standing, watching. I thought they were messing with me, but their faces looked dead serious. We all went out on the porch to see if anyone was still there, but the forest was just still and silent. We chalked it up to a trick of the light, or maybe someone passing by on a trail. but it was strange. After that, the atmosphere shifted. No one wanted to be alone, and we locked every door and window that night before going to bed. The next day, we went skiing, hoping a day on the slopes would help us shake off the weird vibe. By the time we got back, it was getting dark and the cabin was cold. Someone suggested we start a fire in the living room. When one of my friends went to grab the matches from the kitchen, she froze. She was staring at the kitchen counter, where there were crumbs, smudges, and a half-eaten apple that none of us remembered touching. We'd cleaned up before leaving that morning, and none of us had brought an apple. I checked the back door, and it was unlocked. I know we locked it before leaving, and I'm 100% sure no one had come back early. We all stood there, uneasy, trying to come up with an explanation. But none of it made sense. We tried to laugh it off, but everyone was visibly tense. Later that night, we were in the living room having a couple of drinks, when one of the girls got up to go to the bathroom. After a few minutes, we heard a faint scream. She came back, pale as a ghost, and told us she'd seen a face staring through the bathroom window, just for a second before it disappeared. It couldn't have been any of us, and we were on the second floor, so whoever it was would have had to climb onto the roof or something. We searched the whole cabin and outside, but there was no one around, just footprints in the snow, circling the lodge. They were clear and unmistakable, leading from the back of the house, around the porch, and back to the tree line. It looked like someone had been pacing around the cabin, watching us from every angle. That night, none of us slept well. The third day, we stuck together. We tried to act normal, but everyone was on edge. We didn't go skiing, figuring it'd be safer to stick around the cabin and keep an eye out. At one point, one of the guys checked the crawl space under the house. It was just a small space, barely big enough for someone to lie down, but it looked like someone had been down there recently. There were bits of trash, an old blanket, and what looked like food wrappers tucked in the corners. It reeked, and it wasn't stuff we'd brought with us. None of us wanted to talk about what that could mean, but it was obvious someone had been hiding out there, possibly for a while. After that, we didn't feel safe anymore. We debated whether to pack up and leave, but we'd paid a lot for the lodge and didn't have any place else to go. Instead, we agreed to double-check everything, lock the doors, and keep the fire burning all night. One of us stayed up each hour, listening for any noises. It was tense and quiet, the kind of silence where every creak and pop of the cabin makes you jump. On the fourth night, just after midnight, we heard footsteps outside again. This time they were closer, circling slowly. We turned off all the lights and watched from the upstairs windows. A figure appeared just outside the glow of the porch light, moving along the tree line. They were tall and wearing what looked like dark clothes, but we couldn't make out any details. They moved slowly, methodically, and didn't seem in a hurry. The figure disappeared behind the trees, and we stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting. No one said much. The mood had shifted from fear to something else, maybe anger, or just exhaustion. We wanted to confront whoever it was, but we were all scared too. We knew that being isolated without cell service or neighbors made us vulnerable, and there was no telling what this person wanted. On our last day, we packed up early, barely speaking, just wanting to get out of there. As we loaded up the car, we saw it. One last set of footprints leading up to the cabin door, fresh in the snow, distinct and solitary. They didn't go anywhere else, just up to the door and then back into the woods, as if whoever it was had been waiting for us to leave. We didn't waste time trying to figure it out. We got in the car, left, and didn't look back. Back in town, we called the rental company to report what happened. They sounded surprised, but not overly concerned, which made me think this wasn't the first complaint they'd had about that place. One of my friends went online and found stories about people disappearing around that area, hikers going missing in the woods and never being found. We didn't dwell on it, didn't want to think about it.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.